Imagine a child walking home from school. He is 7 years old, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders, his small shoes tapping against the sidewalk as he follows the same path he takes every day. The December air is cool, but not too cold, and the boy is thinking about home, about his brothers, his sisters, his parents, maybe even about what might be for dinner. He is a child who belongs to a family, a child who feels safe in his world. But on this day, safety will vanish. On this day, he will take a ride that he will never forget. This is the story of Steven Gregory Stayner, a story of innocence stolen, of years erased, of lies told so often that they almost became truth. It is a story that begins with tragedy, twists into horror, and ends with an act of courage so profound that it still echoes today. In 1965, in the small town of Merced, California, Delbert and Cary Stayner welcomed their third child, a baby boy they named Steven. The Stayners were a working-class family. They didn't have much, but they had each other. The children played outside, rode bikes, and grew up in a time when parents believed the world was safe enough to let them roam freely through their neighborhoods. Steven was the kind of child who laughed easily. He had soft features, a playful energy, and the curiosity that so often defines childhood. He loved being part of a big family. His brothers and sisters were his world. To his parents, he was a sweet little boy full of life and potential. By December of 1972, Steven was 7 years old. He attended school like any normal child, and every afternoon, he made the walk back home. It was such a routine that his parents didn't think much of it. In those days, children walked to and from school without the kind of fear and hesitation that grips parents today. It was a different era, but danger has always existed. It only hides until the moment it chooses to strike. On the afternoon of December 4th, 1972, Steven left school as usual. The sun was beginning to sink, casting long shadows across Merced. He was heading toward home, but along the way, he was approached by a man. That man was Irvin Murphy, a drifter who had recently fallen under the sway of someone else. Murphy was harmless enough on his own, but he had been persuaded, manipulated, and used by a man named Kenneth Parnell. Parnell was already a convicted child molester. He had served time for his crimes, but he was back on the streets, and his dark desires had not changed. He wanted another child, one he could take, one he could mold, one he could keep. He convinced Murphy to help him carry out his plan. Murphy's role was simple: to approach a child, gain his trust, and bring him to Parnell. On that December afternoon, Murphy spotted Steven. He told him that he and Parnell were collecting donations for a church, that they wanted to help children and families in need. Murphy asked Steven if his mother or father might be willing to donate. Steven, young and polite, said they probably could. That was when Murphy offered him a ride home to ask. It was a seemingly harmless gesture, the kind of thing a trusting child might accept without hesitation. And Steven did. He climbed into the car, believing he would be dropped off at his house, believing that in just a few minutes he would see his family again. But instead, the car carried him farther and farther away from everything familiar. When the car stopped, Kenneth Parnell was waiting. At first, Parnell treated Steven gently. He didn't use violence. Instead, he used words. He began weaving a story that would become the foundation of Steven's new life. He told the boy that his parents didn't want him anymore, that they had too many children, that they couldn't afford to take care of him, that he now had custody, and that Steven would be living with him as his son. Imagine being 7 years old and hearing those words. Imagine being told that your mother and father no longer wanted you, that everything you believed about your family's love was false. It was devastating, but Parnell didn't stop there. To complete the deception, he gave Steven a new identity. He told him that his name was no longer Steven Stayner. From now on, he would be Dennis Gregory Parnell. The lies didn't sink in immediately. For the first few days, Steven cried. He asked about his mother, his father, his brothers and sisters. He asked to go home, but every time, Parnell repeated the same story. They don't want you. I'm your father now. And slowly, under the weight of those words, Steven began to believe. He stopped asking. He began to answer to the name Dennis. His real identity, the truth of who he was, began to blur. Back in Merced, his family's world collapsed. When Steven did not come home that day, panic spread quickly. Kay called the police. Delbert searched frantically. Posters went up. Neighbors joined the hunt, and every lead was followed. But Steven had vanished. Christmas came without him. His siblings sat around the tree, opening gifts, each of them aware that one was missing. His older brother Cary looked at the empty space and wondered where his little brother was. His parents clung to hope, but as days turned to weeks and weeks to months, hope became a fragile thread. Meanwhile, Parnell settled into life with his new son. He moved frequently, staying ahead of suspicion. He enrolled Steven in school under the name Dennis Parnell. To the outside world, it appeared he was just a single father raising his boy. No one asked too many questions. No one looked too closely. And as the years passed, Steven's old life faded further into memory. But the truth could never be fully erased. Deep inside, Steven still remembered his real name, his real family, the life he had once known. He carried that memory quietly, even as he grew into adolescence under the shadow of his abductor. Parnell's control was not just psychological. He began to abuse Steven in ways that robbed him of his innocence. The trauma was constant, a dark secret that Steven bore in silence. He was allowed certain freedoms. He could go to school, make friends, even move around in public. But the invisible chains of fear, manipulation, and abuse held him firmly in place. Escape never felt like an option. Year after year, Steven stayed. By the time he was a teenager, he had been living as Dennis Parnell longer than he had ever lived as Steven Stayner. His childhood had been consumed by lies, and still his family back in Merced kept his memory alive. Kay never gave up hope. Delbert searched for answers. Cary and the other children lived in the shadow of a brother who had vanished. 7 years passed, with no sign, no clue, nothing but the pain of not knowing. But everything would change when another child entered Kenneth Parnell's orbit, another boy who would become the key to Steven's freedom. By 1979, 7 years had passed since Steven Stayner had last seen his family. 7 years of living under the control of Kenneth Parnell. 7 years of being told he was unwanted, unloved, abandoned. By now, Steven was 14 years old. He had grown taller, stronger. His face had matured. His voice had deepened. He was no longer a little boy, but a teenager, carrying the burden of a stolen childhood. And with time, something within him began to change. The older he got, the less control Parnell seemed to have. The lies that once felt unshakable began to crack. Somewhere inside, Steven started to see through them. He knew Parnell wasn't his father. He knew he had once been someone else. He still remembered, even if faintly, that he was a Stayner, not a Parnell. Kenneth Parnell, however, was not satisfied. As Steven became older, Parnell's twisted desires began to drift toward younger children again. To him, Steven was no longer enough. He wanted another boy, younger, more pliable, easier to control. Parnell began to talk openly about it, and his words terrified Steven. In February of 1980, Parnell enlisted the help of another young man, one of Steven's acquaintances named Sean Poorman. Parnell manipulated Sean much like he had manipulated Irvin Murphy years before, convincing him to help abduct a child. The target this time was a 5-year-old boy named Timothy White. On the evening of February 14th, Valentine's Day, Timothy White was walking home from school in Ukiah, California. He was small, blonde-haired, innocent. Sean Poorman lured him toward the car, and in a moment that would forever change his life, Timothy was taken. The boy was brought back to Parnell's home, the same way Steven had been years earlier. Parnell wasted no time. He cut Timothy's hair, tried to make him look different, and once again began weaving the same lies. He told Timothy his parents no longer wanted him, that he would be staying with Parnell now. But unlike 7-year-old Steven back then, Timothy didn't believe it. He cried constantly. He begged for his parents. He wanted to go home. Steven watched this unfold with a heavy heart. For the first time, he truly saw his own childhood reflected back at him. The fear, the confusion, the devastating lies. He saw himself in Timothy's tears. And in that moment, something inside him broke free. He had been too young to fight back when it happened to him. He had been too small, too scared. But now, at 14, he wasn't powerless anymore. He was stronger. He was old enough to understand right from wrong. And he could no longer sit back and watch another child's life be destroyed the way his had been. Steven made a decision. He was going to save Timothy. It was not a decision made lightly. For years, Parnell had convinced him that escape was impossible, that no one would believe him, that he had nowhere to go. The fear of punishment and the years of manipulation weighed heavily. But as Steven looked at Timothy, trembling and crying for his mother, he knew he had to act. Over the next few days, Steven began planning. He waited for the right moment. Parnell often left the boys alone when he went to work, trusting that Steven was too broken to resist. But now, that trust would be his undoing. On March 1, 1980, Parnell left the house for his night shift at a local resort. As the door closed behind him, Steven turned to Timothy. He told him that they were going to run. He promised to take him home. Timothy was terrified, but he trusted the older boy. That night, the two of them set out on foot. They walked for miles through the dark, uncertain of where they were heading, but determined to get away. Steven had no map, no car, no real plan beyond one thing: to get Timothy back to his parents. For hours they moved through the night, two figures against the backdrop of freedom they had both been denied. Finally, as the sun began to rise, they reached the small town of Ukiah. Exhausted, hungry, and unsure of what to do next, Steven led Timothy to a local police station. He pushed the younger boy forward and told him to go inside. Timothy hesitated, but Steven reassured him. And then, together, they stepped into the building. Inside, the officers looked up in surprise at the sight of two boys standing in front of them. Timothy immediately began to cry. He said his name, said he wanted to go home. The police officers comforted him, promising that everything would be okay. Then they turned to Steven. At first, Steven hesitated. He had been Dennis for so long that the words didn't come easily. But finally, he looked at the officers and said the words that would shatter 7 years of lies. "I know my first name is Steven." With that, the truth came rushing back. Steven Stayner, the boy who had vanished from Merced, California in 1972, was alive. He had been missing for 7 years, presumed dead by many, mourned but never forgotten by his family. And now he was standing in a police station, not only alive, but a hero who had saved another child. The police quickly confirmed his story. Timothy White was reunited with his parents that very day, their reunion filled with tears of relief and joy. For Steven, the path back to his family was more complicated. News spread like wildfire. A boy abducted at age 7 had returned as a teenager. Cameras followed. Reporters wrote headlines. Neighbors gossiped. The Stayners were stunned. Kay and Delbert received the phone call they had prayed for, but never truly believed would come. Their son was alive. Their Steven was coming home. When Steven returned to Merced, the reunion was bittersweet. His family embraced him, held him, cried tears of joy. His mother couldn't believe she was holding her son again. His father, stoic but deeply moved, welcomed him back. His siblings, now older, surrounded him with love. But 7 years had passed. 7 years can change everything. The little boy they had lost had come back as a teenager. He had missed birthdays, holidays, milestones. The world he returned to was no longer the same one he had left. His siblings had grown up. His parents had aged. His own childhood had been stolen, replaced with years of manipulation and abuse. And Steven himself had changed. He was no longer the innocent child who had walked home from school that December day. He was a survivor, strong, courageous, but also deeply scarred. For the Stayner family, joy was tempered with pain. They had their son back, but they could never get back the years that had been lost. Steven struggled to adjust to normal life. He wanted to fit in, to be like other kids his age, but how could he? He carried the weight of experiences most adults could never comprehend. And yet, even in his struggle, there was triumph. He had saved Timothy White. He had broken the cycle. He had done what no one thought possible. He had escaped. The Stayner household, once marked by grief and absence, became a place of celebration when Steven came back. The neighbors came by to see him, reporters crowded the street, cameras flashed, microphones were shoved in his face. To the outside world, it was a miracle, a missing child found after 7 years, alive and safe. To the Stayners, it was a dream come true, but dreams rarely match reality. Steven had grown up in a world separate from theirs. He didn't know how to slot back into the rhythms of family life. At 14, he was far more independent than most kids his age, because he had been forced to be. He smoked cigarettes, he came and went when he wanted. He didn't ask permission, he didn't follow rules the way his siblings did. He had learned survival on his own, not discipline within a family. For his parents, especially his father Delbert, this was difficult. Delbert had hoped his son would return as the boy they lost, the little Steven who wanted to play in the yard, laugh at cartoons, and sit at the table with his family. Instead, they had a teenager who had been shaped by someone else's hand, someone else's lies. Steven's mother, Kay, tried to hold everything together. She showered her son with love, trying to make up for the lost years. She listened when he spoke. She supported him in his efforts to fit in. But there was a gap between them, one forged by time and trauma, and it could not be erased overnight. His siblings also struggled. Cary, his older brother, had lived for years in the shadow of his disappearance. Cary had carried guilt, wondering why it wasn't him who was taken, why his younger brother had been the one stolen. Cary had stepped into the role of protector for the other siblings, and now, with Steven's return, he found himself overshadowed by the attention given to his brother. This tension lingered quietly, unspoken, but real. Steven himself felt the weight of expectation. People called him a hero for saving Timothy White. Reporters painted him as brave, strong, and triumphant. But privately, Steven didn't feel like a hero. He felt broken. He had been abused in ways he could barely bring himself to admit. He had been manipulated into believing lies for so long that his sense of self was fractured. He had lost the years that should have been carefree, formative, and full of discovery. And now, suddenly, everyone expected him to be whole. When Kenneth Parnell was arrested, Steven was forced to face him again, this time in court. The trial drew national attention. Parnell, the man who had stolen 7 years of his life, sat just feet away from him in the courtroom. Prosecutors laid out the case. Parnell had kidnapped Steven at age 7, brainwashed him, abused him, and raised him as his own child. They detailed the abduction of Timothy White, the lies, the manipulation, the years of concealment. Witnesses came forward, evidence was shown, and the story gripped the country. But when the verdict came, it was not what many expected. Parnell was convicted, but not for kidnapping Steven. Because so many years had passed, and because of the way the law was written at the time, prosecutors could not charge him for the abduction of Steven Stayner. Instead, he was convicted only for the kidnapping of Timothy White, and even that carried a shockingly light sentence. Kenneth Parnell was given just 7 years in prison. 7 years, the same amount of time Steven had spent in captivity. It was as if the system weighed a stolen childhood and declared it equal to 7 years behind bars. The Stayners were devastated. Steven in particular struggled to understand how justice could be so small, so hollow. The man who had taken everything from him would serve a sentence shorter than the time he had stolen. Parnell, for his part, showed little remorse. He portrayed himself as a misunderstood father figure, downplaying his crimes. He walked into prison not as a monster in his own mind, but as someone who still clung to the lies he had told for years. For Steven, the trial closed one chapter but opened another. He was free, but freedom came with challenges. He returned to school, but fitting in was nearly impossible. He was older than his classmates, but socially behind. He had lived through experiences no one else could understand. His classmates treated him like an outsider, sometimes with pity, sometimes with cruelty. Steven longed for normalcy. He wanted to be just another teenager, not the boy who had been kidnapped. But the media attention made that impossible. Everywhere he went, people knew his name, his face, his story. He had become a symbol, and symbols rarely get to be ordinary. As he moved into his teenage years and then adulthood, Steven tried to carve out a life for himself. He eventually got married, building a family of his own. He became a father, determined to give his children the love and security he had been denied. In many ways he succeeded. Those who knew him said he was a devoted husband, a caring father, and a man who never stopped fighting to overcome his past. But the scars remained. The trauma never fully left him. He wrestled with feelings of inadequacy, with the weight of what had been done to him, with the sense that he could never fully reclaim what was lost. He carried guilt, too. Guilt that he hadn't escaped sooner. Guilt that maybe he could have stopped Parnell earlier. Guilt that gnawed at him even though he had done everything he could. The Stayner family, too, bore its own scars. The years of Steven's absence had changed them forever. Cary, his older brother, continued to struggle with feelings of being overlooked, of living in Steven's shadow. That quiet resentment would grow over time, manifesting in ways no one could have imagined. In the years that followed, Steven did his best to move forward. He worked, he raised his children, he tried to heal. His story was turned into a book, then a television movie titled, I Know My First Name is Steven. He participated in its creation, wanting the world to understand not just what happened to him, but what it did to him. The film brought his story to millions, but it also reopened wounds. Seeing his trauma portrayed on screen was painful. Reliving the moments of his abduction, his years of captivity, and his escape was like tearing off scabs that had barely begun to form. Still, Steven endured it, believing it was important for people to know the truth. But just as Steven was building a life beyond his past, tragedy struck again. In September of 1989, at the age of just 24, Steven Stayner was riding his motorcycle home from work when he was struck by a car. The crash was fatal. The boy who had survived 7 years of captivity, who had escaped his abductor, who had saved another child's life, was gone in an instant. His death sent shockwaves through his family and the community. The pain of losing him after everything he had endured was almost unbearable. His wife lost a husband. His children lost a father. His parents, who had once lost him to kidnapping and miraculously gotten him back, were forced to bury him far too soon. At his funeral, hundreds gathered to pay their respects. Timothy White, the little boy Steven had saved nearly a decade earlier, was there as a pallbearer. He was just 14 years old then, the same age Steven had been when he carried him to freedom. Timothy never forgot what Steven had done for him. He would later say that Steven was his hero, the person who gave him his life back. That bond, formed in terror and escape, lasted a lifetime. The world mourned the loss of Steven Stayner. His story had inspired millions, and his courage had shown what resilience and bravery look like even in the darkest circumstances. But behind the headlines and tributes, his family was left with a silence that could never be filled. In the years after Steven's tragic death, his story continued to ripple outward. For those who had followed his case, it was a reminder of how cruel fate could be. A boy who survived the impossible only to die in a sudden accident. For his family, the grief was indescribable. They had fought for years to keep hope alive when he was gone, rejoiced when he returned, endured the painful process of healing, and then, just as they thought they had turned a corner, tragedy came again. Timothy White carried Steven's memory with him for the rest of his life. As a child, he had been saved by Steven's bravery. As a man, he honored that gift. Timothy grew up to be a devoted husband and father, living a quiet life in California. He became a sheriff's deputy, choosing a career in law enforcement, perhaps as a way of giving back, of protecting others the way Steven had protected him. But Timothy too would face an early death. In 2010, at just 35 years old, Timothy White died from a pulmonary embolism. His passing reopened old wounds for those who remembered the Stayner case. Two boys linked forever by a shared nightmare and a shared act of courage, and both lost far too soon. At Timothy's funeral, members of the Stayner family came to honor him. It was a painful reminder of the tragedies that seemed to follow them, but also a testament to the bond between Steven and Timothy that had never been broken. Even in death, their stories were intertwined. Kenneth Parnell, the man responsible for so much suffering, lived long enough to once again reveal his true nature. After serving just 5 years of his 7-year sentence for Timothy White's kidnapping, he was released in the mid-1980s. For years he lived quietly, avoided by many who knew his name. But predators rarely change. In 2003, decades after Steven's escape, Parnell was arrested again. This time, he had tried to convince a woman to buy him a young boy. She reported him to police, and his past came rushing back into the headlines. He was convicted once more, this time under harsher laws that reflected society's growing awareness of the danger posed by repeat offenders. Parnell was sentenced to life in prison under California's 3 strikes law. He died in 2008 at the age of 76, spending his final years behind bars. For many, his death was a quiet end to a monstrous life, but the scars he left behind remained. Even as the Stayner family tried to heal, darkness struck again in an unimaginable way. Cary Stayner, Steven's older brother, had lived a life marked by his siblings' abduction and return. To outsiders, Cary seemed like a man haunted by tragedy but not dangerous. He worked as a handyman, kept mostly to himself, and was often described as quiet and withdrawn. But beneath the surface, Cary carried his own demons. He had spoken openly about feeling overshadowed by his brother's story, about the resentment of being forgotten while all attention went to Steven. He had a history of mental health struggles, and those who knew him described him as troubled. In 1999, nearly a decade after Steven's death, Cary Stayner committed a series of crimes that shocked the nation. Working as a handyman at a motel near Yosemite National Park, he lured, kidnapped, and brutally murdered 4 women. His crimes were gruesome, calculated, and devastating. The Stayner family, already marked by Steven's abduction and death, was now tied to another nightmare, this time as relatives of a killer. The story that had once been about innocence stolen and courage reclaimed now became tangled with horror, leaving the family in a painful and complicated legacy. For the victims' families, Cary Stayner was not just a troubled brother, but a murderer who had taken their loved ones. For the Stayners, it was another cruel twist of fate. One son stolen by an abductor, another consumed by darkness within himself. Cary Stayner was convicted and sentenced to death. He remains on death row in California, his life a chilling counterpoint to his younger brother's legacy. Stephen's story, however, continues to shine through the darkness. His act of courage in saving Timothy White remains one of the most remarkable escapes in true crime history. He was not just a victim, he was a rescuer, a protector, a young man who risked everything to spare another child from the nightmare he had endured. His legacy lives on in more than just books or television specials. In Merced, California, a statue was erected in his honor, a bronze depiction of Stephen walking hand in hand with Timothy White. The statue stands as a reminder not just of the tragedy, but of the triumph of the human spirit. It captures the moment of escape, the moment when one boy decided he would not let another suffer as he had. That statue has become a place of reflection. Visitors stop to look, to remember, to think about what it means to lose childhood to cruelty, and yet find the strength to act with bravery beyond measure. For those who study true crime, Steven Stayner's case remains one of the most haunting. It highlights the failures of the system that allowed Kenneth Parnell to abduct and abuse for years. It underscores the resilience of children, the ability to survive, even in impossible circumstances. And it reminds us of how trauma lingers long after the headlines fade. Stephen once said, "I returned almost a grown man, and yet my parents saw me at first as their 7-year-old. After they stopped trying to teach me the fundamentals all over again, it became clear I was going to be all right. But getting there wasn't easy." Those words reveal the heart of his story, the struggle to reconcile who he had been with who he had become. They capture the truth that survival is not the end of a story, but the beginning of a long, hard journey. Today, when people hear the name Steven Stayner, they may think first of his abduction, his escape, or the tragic twists that followed. But perhaps the most important thing to remember is the boy who, at 14, chose to act not just for himself but for someone else. He could have remained silent, continued living under Parnell's control, and perhaps no one would have blamed him. But he didn't. He chose to save Timothy White. That choice, an act of courage born from years of suffering, is what defines him. As the camera lingers on the statue of Stephen and Timothy, as the sun sets behind them and shadows stretch across the park, the story closes not with despair but with a bittersweet sense of hope. Evil had stolen years, but it could not steal Stephen's bravery. And so, as we remember his life, his courage, and his legacy, we carry forward the reminder that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit has the power to fight back. For those watching, if this story has moved you, if you believe stories like Stephen's deserve to be remembered and told, then join us. Follow this channel, be part of this community, and together, let us continue to shine a light on the stories that matter, the stories that reveal both the cruelty of the world and the courage that rises to meet it. Because Steven Stayner's story is not just about what was taken from him. It is about what he gave. The gift of freedom to Timothy White, the gift of inspiration to countless others, and the gift of a legacy that endures far beyond tragedy.